whatever you are, whether it's morning as it is here on the East Coast for Connie and some of the others here today, or whether it's afternoon or perhaps even evening. We're glad that you're back, and it's wonderful to see so many of you on, even if it has to be on screen right now, for another session of the STR Meet the Scholars. And it is my absolute great pleasure to have the opportunity to have a conversation today with Professor Constance Helfat from the School of Business at Dartmouth. Connie, as she is known to most of us, I would say, is Senior Associate Dean for Research Innovation. She's also the J. Brian Quinn Professor in Technology and Strategy at Dartmouth and Area Chair for Strategy and Management at TUC. So Connie really doesn't need an introduction, but I will give you, and it's impossible to really do justice to her many, many contributions to the field of strategy, but I will give you just a few highlights from her CV. So Connie did her undergraduate degree at Berkeley and then went to Yale for master's degrees and PhD in economics. Before she joined TUC, she had appointments at the University of California, Davis, Northwestern University, and University of Pennsylvania. Her many contributions to the field of strategy have been recognized through several honors and awards, among which Distinguished Scholar Award from the team division of AOM, the Vipuri Prize in Strategic Management, and as a SMS Fellow. I think she's known to many as the co-editor of Strategic Management Journal over 8 years. Connie just stepped down. I think it was December 2020, so just a couple of months ago. And before that, she was an associate editor or senior editor at Strategic Management Journal, but also at Management Science and Org Science. Connie's impact on the field of strategy has not only been through her tremendous research and many, many publications, but I would say also through her wonderful contributions through editorial roles and just as importantly through her mentorship of junior scholars. So Connie, it's wonderful to see you this morning, and it's a great pleasure to have a conversation with you. Before we get started, I'd like to ask everyone I will stop sharing, and I would like to ask everyone to jump in with questions through chat. I have a few questions that I prepared for Connie myself, and we'll go through those, but then we'll try to incorporate some of your questions and then open it up broadly for Q&A. All right, so Connie, just to get started, I'd like to ask you a little bit about your background. Can you tell us about where you grew up, maybe how you found your path towards academia, what brought you into the academia early on and made you stay there?
Yeah. First of all, it's really nice, you guys, to have me. Thank you for the lovely intro. It's great to see so many people here, people I know, people hopefully I'll meet, maybe in person when we can do this one of these days. So thank you, guys. Let me, and thank you particularly for Joe and Cindy for doing all the heavy lifting to organize this particular session. All right, so my background. So I was born in Cleveland, Ohio, which actually, if you're a kid, is a great place to grow up. I mean, you just walk down the street, find your friends, go bike riding. It's flat, which actually is a big advantage when you're a kid, right? And then my parents moved to the San Francisco Bay Area. And so when I was about 11, so I grew up there. For most of my life, I'd say until about 15 years ago, people would ask me where I'm from. I'd say I'm from California. So now I finally say I'm from New Hampshire, which is where I live. I was an econ major at Berkeley, and I remember my first econ class, I had this big old huge book, like this thick, right? The intro textbook. And I didn't take it my first year because I was afraid like it would be too hard, and so I thought, well, I should try it out. And I actually really loved it. But I remember these intro books, they tell you about the history of the field, which is something you don't get once you get beyond that. And I remember like reading about some research of James Tobin's, and I thought, and they talked about what his dissertation was, how he got started. And I was like, oh, maybe it'd be fun to write a dissertation. All right, so you can imagine that naivete. But that actually got me thinking about grad school. And I went to grad school in economics. I had no idea there was anything called strategy, right? That you could get a PhD in at that point. So that's how I got started.
And then you did your PhD at Yale. And I think I can say for many people, the PhD years are very much formative years. If you look back, what are some of the things, whether ideas or the people you had a chance to talk to, or some events, sort of serendipitous events that influenced how you developed as a PhD student and perhaps even the choice of your dissertation topic?
Yeah, so I went to Yale for two reasons. One, I went there because Jim Tobin was there. He's like my idol from, way back when. And the second reason I went there is because I was really interested in technological change, and Dick Nelson was there. And, when I went around different grad schools, when I was trying to decide where to go, people told me, well, if you want to do technological change, go to Yale, because that's where Dick Nelson is. So that's why I went, those two reasons. And so you can imagine those two people were really influential. And one thing about Yale at the time is, if you go and get an econ degree now in industrial organization economics, you're going to get game theory and asymmetric information and a lot of math. So Yale, what they taught us was actually much more applied stuff. And they also taught us things like evolutionary economics, because Nelson and Winter were there, and they taught us transaction cost economics, which was not a staple at the time in econ departments, still is not, So I had an education that was a little more similar to what you might get in strategy now, except I also got traditional industrial organization economics. So then I wanted to write a dissertation on firms, right? And how they behave. A part of this actually came out of my undergraduate education, where I took a very applied undergraduate course in industrial organization economics, where they went through the history of all these firms and the antitrust and regulation that they were subject to, and how they developed over time. So I thought, okay, I'll write a dissertation on firms. Well, guess what? Economics not so good at that, understanding firms. So I went to Tobin and I said, well, I'm kind of interested in understanding how macroeconomic events affect firm behavior. I thought, okay, that's a route in, where I can study firms. And he said, well, why don't you look at the oil industry? Because this was the time where oil prices were just going nuts and firms were trying to figure out how to cope. And that's how I got started in oil. So if you don't believe in history dependence from reading the real world, from reading Nelson and Winter, I believe it because I'm still doing oil. Right? So it turns out that oil is incredibly high tech on the process technology side, unbelievably high tech. So I wrote a dissertation on how these macroeconomic conditions were affecting firms' investments in capital and in R&D, right, in this really fairly high tech space in traditional and what were at that time alternative energies, right? So it's funny because the world comes around to you, because at the time nobody nobody cared about R&D, if you can believe it, outside of people like Nelson, and after the oil crunch went away, people stopped caring about alternative energy. Right? So here we are again. All right, so I'm happy to see the world come back around. And so all those people were influential. The other person I mentioned was really influential. Two of them. One was Sid Winter, and he was actually my micro professor. My first professor. He hated teaching traditional graduate micro. It's largely math, but he tried to make it a little more applied, if you could call it that. But and then I went on to learn a lot of evolutionary economics from Sid and from Dick. But Sid was really focused on firms, whereas Dick was a little more focused on the technology. So those two folks together were really important for me. And the last person was one of my dissertation advisors, who was Rick Levin, who went on to be the president of Yale University, who's a very applied IO economist. So that's how I got started.
So it sounds like a lot of that, a lot of sort of those influences happened during your PhD years. Did something similar happen when you were an assistant professor at the several, some of the other institutions where you spent time?
Yeah, I mean, when I think about my career and the influences, it always goes back to people. And then the ideas that people brought with them. So, what you heard me talk about was the people. So I'm going to talk about this when I was assistant professor, right? I was really lucky. So some of the really key people, first of all, Sid Winter, I kept in touch with him all the time, partly because I started out at UC Davis and he had family there. Also then I ended up going down to Washington, DC a lot to use my R&D data. And by then Sid had moved down there. So it was really easy for me to keep in touch. And so we would go out to lunch and talk about research all the time. It was an enormous help. And then when I went out to UC Davis, I went out there partly because I wanted to be in Northern California at the time. And so people at Yale had connections with this new business school at UC Davis. And so, and they also said, well, advisor Rick Levin said, I'll put you in touch with David Teese. Oh my God, I thought David was a god. So I'm like, yeah, okay, we'll go talk. Sure, okay. So, and so David, he had a huge influence on me. He was probably the reason I left economics to go to strategy. He just kept badgering me. Connie, you're in the wrong field. Connie, you're in the wrong field. There are all these people in the field of strategy interested in what you're interested in. Nobody in economics is interested in what you're interested in. Well, not nobody, but not that many. You need to come to strategy. So, and so that was hugely important. And then he said to me, hey, by the way, Northwestern's got a job and you need to apply for it. You don't say no to David Teese when you're an assistant professor. So I'm like, okay, I'll apply for this job. And Cynthia Montgomery and Birger Wernerfeld and Rafi Amit were at Northwestern. And, they were looking for people with econ degrees to convert to strategy. And so I was poster child number 1 and Margie Petteroff was poster child number 2. And along the way, when I went there, Cynthia and Berger started hammering me about the resource-based view of the firm, which I'd never heard of, right? Which is pretty early at the time. And I thought, oh, maybe this is something that I could think about for my work. And at the same time, when I was out at Davis, this is when David came up with the idea for dynamic capabilities. And so, I had that burned into my brain. And so that was all hugely important. And then I went to Wharton because Northwestern was having what I would call some identity problems in strategy, and Cynthia and Berger left for that reason. So I thought, well, maybe I'll look around. And so when I went to Wharton, Dan Leventhal was there. I did, which was hugely influential to talk to him, and Harbir Singh, and then Sid Winter showed up again a couple of years later. So again, I learned, and Bruce Kogut also was a huge influence. Dan and Bruce were really interested in evolutionary thinking. So, I learned a lot from them. And then Harbir was more on the RBV side. And again, very informative and creative scholar. So all these people, I still use everything I learned from these people today and their work, of course. But, there's kind of no substitute for talking to people. You can read their research. You don't actually know what is important to them and what they really think is key about what's in their research until you talk to them. So I consider myself enormously lucky. Just really enormously lucky to have had all these people to talk to.
So building on precisely that point, what is it that you're focused on right now, and how do you actually choose your next project, and have you changed the process through which you decide on what your next project should be?
Well, I'm always looking for things where I can learn more about my ideas. So in one sense, I wouldn't be in this profession if it weren't for the ideas. right? Otherwise, yeah, you can do all kinds of stuff. You can pump out papers, but why do this, right? If that's all you're going to do, I mean, you can make a lot more money, right? And maybe have an easier life in some sense, right? Like we're always on, we're always working, you know. So it's the idea. So I'm always looking for something that'll advance my ideas, right? And I get ideas from doing research, right? So those are the, you know, it's like, wow, I've learned this, but what am I missing about this picture? You know, oh yeah, or I get an insight. And that drives my next project. So I'm always looking for projects where I can learn more about the things that are motivating me. So for example, I'm really interested in doing more empirically with my idea about resource redeployment, right? That's something I thought about, you know, I came up with, it was like, you know, it's just a light bulb went off after I heard Kathy Eisenhart give a paper years ago. And, you know, like, so there are people, you know, unfortunately I have Tim and Samina who are here who've been my partners in crime, and particularly Tim really pushing on this, you know, because it's not something you can do single-handedly with some of these ideas. But I'm looking to do, so I'm always on the lookout for people who want to do more empirical research on that. I'm still interested in my ideas about vertical integration, you know, and why some firms vertically stay integrated and some don't, which I did with Miguel Campo-Rambato and Org Science. There's always a time dimension in a lot of my work. How do firms deal with their resources and their capabilities over time, right? And so, and that comes from the evolutionary perspective. It comes from the tension between flexibility and rigidity that I'm interested in. You know, so I'm always looking for things that can help me push that forward. And the other thing I'm interested in is the tension between individual and organizational influences on organization outcomes. And so again, I'm on the lookout for things like that. So I'm on the lookout for people and data that might be promising for that. You know, and the latest thing that I'm looking for is any empirical ways to think about shaping the external environment. And by this, I mean like fundamentally reshaping the payoff structure for all organizations. So that's the other thing I'm now on the lookout for. And the reason I've been interested in this question for like since the early 90s, partly from being at Yale, hearing everybody talk about coevolution between firms and their external environment with no sense of like, this is a chicken and egg problem. I can't get my hands around you know, where's cause and effect in this whole thing? And it was always very diffuse. And so my work with Giovanni Gavetti and Luigi Marengo in strategy science, we're able to start making some progress. So again, you know, these things all go together. But so I look for things where I can learn more and dig into the ideas that I have.
You mentioned earlier just how important talking to people is to really get to the bottom of the idea itself, right? And the sort of that really key nugget of insight that perhaps doesn't always come through as much as we'd wanted in the written work. Gwen Lee just asking on chat, like if talking to people is not as easily available, especially to PhD students, what would you recommend? What is your advice to people who do not have easy access?
Well, you can talk to your advisors because, you know, they're more steeped in the literature. So my advice is don't just read the literature. Talk to other people who, you know, talk to your fellow grad students. What are they seeing in this? Talk to your advisors because your advisors are going to talk to other people. You know, this is a big stream of people knowing people, right? And how are people interpreting the literature? So the big advice is not necessarily talk to the authors because you can't always do that, but talk to other people about these ideas. Don't just read the literature and try and infer from what's on the written page. That's really the advice I would give. So all right, Gwen's got the thumbs up. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Asim, for sharing the paper on shaping, and I think you're putting a few more for links in the chat for everyone else to access if they'd like to. So I'm taking away from what you said so far that there are three key ingredients to maintaining momentum in your research. One is this belief that an idea is never finished, that there's more to always discover and always sort of bring forward to the field. Two is that data is always key, and you're also the initiator and founder of the 5 project, and I'd like to ask you a little bit more about that. And then 3, it's collaborators and co-authors, which are incredibly important in just, again, keeping that momentum going. Can you tell us a little bit more about your 5 project?
Yeah, that, I feel badly about that because doing all these other stuff I've ended up doing, like SMJ, I haven't, I've been very slow loading data sets up. But that came out of, before I started being SMJ co-editor, I do think that you need theory, you need ideas, but honestly, you need to go to the real world, either qualitative or quantitative data. And actually, sometimes you need to study these things without, hypothesis testing, because that's like looking under the lamppost sometimes. Maybe you need to actually, ask a well-informed question and think more broadly. But what I realized is, I think one of the things that strategic management brings to the academic endeavor is that we collect unique data. Either publicly available data that requires quite a bit of work to put into some sort of usable form, or hand collected, and a lot of it is still hand collected, or scraping off the web or whatever, these really unique data sets, right? It's like a claim to fame. And I thought, well, we're collecting all these data sets and no one gets to reuse them again. How crazy is this? Right? Couldn't we make this available as a public good? And I thought, well, you need to give people an opportunity to get them, several studies out of their data, right? But after that, if they're not going to use it, maybe people could add to these data or use them in other studies. So the idea of the 5 project was to facilitate that. I said, look, we'll load these up, we'll do the work for you, we'll help you with documentation because it needs to be user-friendly. It'll be open. And so there are I managed to get several people on board with this. And so we were able to jumpstart it and I've been able to add a few data sets here and there. What I learned over time is that with older data, particularly the old data where people didn't have it all computerized easily, they don't have the documentation. The files are in, a format we can't use anymore easily. And so that actually has been a struggle. I do have some data sets I'm eventually hoping to load up. They just take a long time, you need to get co-author permissions. It turns out to be more of a mess than you think. So what's much more promising is to get people who have created their data sets like in the last 10 years and have good records and everything's in nice machine readable form. And so this is a lot more promising. So where I've really been able to make traction is SMJ started this open data badge opportunity. And some people have wanted to take advantage of it, and you have to load up your data on open access website, and some people have chosen to use files. So like Brent Goldfarb and Samdeep Pillai have this wonderful data set on the auto industry that's up there now. So that's the kind of thing I'm hoping for, to build a community, where you can go look for data sets. So people are using these data sets for now are largely teaching, grad student teaching, where they're, we need a data set, where the students can run something. But, some of these are, a few of them are more up to date and you could add to them or use them. But that was the idea. I'm hoping once I get out from under the rest of my SMJ decisions and some of my admin stuff at Dartmouth, that I'd be able to go back to the 5 project and make more headway with it. Because I would really like to have a resource that people could use and add to going forward.
Luis was just asking on that point, what's your advice to younger scholars who want to publish a few papers on their data before sharing it, and when should they when should they share the data openly?
Yeah, when you think you sort of, gotten 80% out of it, 90% out of it, what you think you're going to get, it takes people a while to use your data, right? If they're going to add to it, whatever. And besides, they have to think of what to do with it. And they're not necessarily going to think of your idea, right? So I would say once you feel like you've gotten, a large portion of it, but you'd like to do something for the community. Also, you might find co-authors that way, because sometimes people will come to you and say, I have an idea, but I don't know these data that well. And, are you interested? So there might actually be some upside to doing that.
Yeah, I remember at some point you mentioned that it would be wonderful for one of these sort of public forums, whether it's AOM or SMS or maybe sort of smaller groups, to allow people to pitch their data, right? Somebody has occasionally a very advantageous in with a firm or to a data set, but they don't always know how to make the most of it. And maybe that's something that we can all think about. What's the right way to facilitate the matching in the academic field between access to data and big ideas that can be answered. I'd like to ask you about the strategy field more broadly. You've seen the field evolve over the years, and you spend a lot of time trying to understand it, the various phenomena in it from different theoretical perspectives. So right now, today, what are some of the most interesting phenomena emerging that you are studying, or that you think others in the strategy field should study?
Oh boy. I hate to tell people what they should study. You should study what you're interested in, right? Yeah. I mean, one thing about strategy is it's, something Dick Ramel mentioned years ago, and he's right. He said, it's a field, he put it in less, he's in more skeptical terms, but it's a field that follows what firms are doing, right? What are the big problems that firms are confronting? That is what we tend to study, right? Mm-hmm. And so, what are they confronting today? Well, tech, all right? I mean, am I telling you something you don't know? No. Non-market issues, are big. There's a lot of pressure, some in the US, much more in Europe, on, the natural environment in particular. I think that, so clearly those things are going to get studied anyway. Right. I think the question is to really try and understand deeply what the firms are doing and why. Right. And because we don't understand that, it's really hard to give advice. Right. To the extent that you care about advice. Right. Some of us don't actually care about advice. We just want to understand, which honestly I think is fine. But other people would like to give advice, which I think is useful. And if you don't understand really at the root cause of what's going on, you're going to give it bad advice, basically, right? So, I think those are two things. I mean, well, what am I interested in? I like to see more work on shaping, to be, let's just keep hammering. One thing I've learned over the years is if you're interested in something, you have just got to keep saying it over and over and over again. Right? Till maybe a few people go, oh, what's this? Maybe we should think about it, But, and the other thing I think is, I mean, it's interesting, like in this quest to sort of understand what firms are doing, we sometimes forget about the basics. And I really think, so my basics are resources and capabilities, right? Other people have other basics like rivalry or competition, right? But I think we tend to forget about the basics when we answer these questions and ask, what more can we learn about these basics rather than just chasing the next phenomenon, with the latest, way of thinking about it. And so I would really like to see people integrate some of the basics, resources and capabilities. what do we know about diversification? There's a heck of a lot of stuff in these new phenomena like tech that involve diversification. They're like missing in action. I mean, in the literature on tech, every once in a while I see a paper that mentions, that is on diversification in tech. I'm like, yeah, these tech companies, Amazon, why does Amazon look like this? Oh, well, how could does this make any sense from what we know about diversification, resources, and capabilities? Why aren't there more studies on this? I really think we need to take these phenomena and link them back to our core and think, what can we learn more about the core and about the phenomena at the same time?
So can I push a little bit more on that idea? Because I know that one of the things that you have fully embraced at SMJ is this idea of replication and just sort of confirming and existing theories in the context of new phenomena or with new data. Do you think we need a lot more of that going forward rather than trying to reinvent the wheel every single time we write a paper?
Oh, I'm a big fan. All right, so I have been on record as saying something that some might get taken out of context, but I'll say it again, novelty is overrated, right? The notion that every paper must have brand new theory and have some magnificent new result. I mean, this is crazy. We need cumulative knowledge building in this field, right? Otherwise, I mean, let me ask the really basic epistemological question. How can we say that we know anything, right? You have got to build cumulative knowledge, right? And by the way, this does come out of my research, right? My interest in path dependence and evolution and learning, right? But for that, you need, so replication, to my mind, is just one part of that, building cumulative knowledge, right? And we called it quasi-replication in that special issue, the idea that you're going to try and take a prior study, hopefully one that's well cited, it's not, so we can build on the knowledge and say, well, how well does this transfer to another setting, another time period, an industry that maybe, if you're looking at a tech industry, a different industry that involves a lot of tech, but maybe a little has some other, it's not the same technology. Or even, what if you update it with more recent methods, right? Or, more recent ways of constructing variables. Might help us learn what we know and what we don't know, and actually open up new things to think about. So I don't view replication as simply, oh, the old result does or doesn't hold up. First of all, one study cannot tell you that, right? One replication can't tell you that. But it might open up new ways of thinking, oh, this did hold up and that didn't. I wonder what else we could look at. That's part of cumulative knowledge building. So that's what I think. And also building the cumulative knowledge, it does tend to give you new ideas. So they are a basis for new theory. But new theory can grow out of trying to build cumulative knowledge. They're not necessarily antithetical. All right. So that's how I view replication. It's a tool in the toolkit.
So thinking both about what you just said and your work as a researcher, so your own work, but also all the hundreds or maybe thousands of papers you've seen as an editor, I'm going to ask you the question that I'm pretty sure you've been asked 100 times at least. What do you think makes a great paper, and what is sort of the difference between a good paper and a great paper, and how has your opinion of what makes a good paper change or a great paper changed over time?
Yeah, I don't think my opinions change that much of what makes a great paper. Maybe let me say what makes a good paper, because great papers are hard to write. Okay. I mean, we should all be so lucky as to write one great paper in our life. I'm happy with just some good papers. All right. So what makes a good paper? I think good paper, an idea. Right. I mean, and this is, does go to part of the advice thing. But, methods are, you need good methods, but without a good idea, nobody's going to read the paper, right? So what, right? And a good idea doesn't have to be like some amazing new thing. It has to be something interesting and, somewhat relevant to how firms operate. right? And their performance outcomes, right? You don't need performance DV in every paper, right? But it needs to be relevant to that and needs something interesting, right? And you know, what's interesting? Well, okay, maybe you should ask your colleagues, do you find this interesting, right? Does this help us learn more, you know, in a maybe a not completely obvious way? A replication would be an exception to that, right? But for other papers, you know, something interesting about what firms are doing, how they do it, you know, but it doesn't have to be some massively, you know, amazing new thing. And like I say, it's hard to find interesting. So that's why I would go to your colleagues and say, well, do you think this is interesting? Or here I have this setting. I'm kind of interested in this. You know, what do you think about this? See what people like, what resonates. You know, what do people want to learn more about? And then triangulate that with what do you want to learn more about? You know, but yeah, so interesting, right? For better or for worse, ill-defined.
I'd like to ask you one last, if I can rephrase that a little bit. What would Connie today advise that Connie that went to Yale maybe just a few years ago? What would your advice be to your younger self as a sort of starting out in the strategy field?
Yeah, okay. Well, part of it is don't do what I did, right? So, you know, I'm one of these people who's interested in just about everything. It's a blessing and a curse at the same time, right? So when I first started out, I had all these projects I wanted to do, and so David T sat me down. He said, "Okay, what are you working on?" So I start telling him, and I get partway through my spiel. And he goes, "No, no, 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 no." And I'm like, "What do you mean?" He says, "You can't do all this." He says, "And it's completely on these things. How are these things related to each other?" You know, I'm like, "They have to be related to each other." You know, I'm like, "Oh." He says, "Yeah, you can't. You'll never get nobody's gonna know what you do or care about it if you don't have a clear theme to your work." All right. I'm like, "Oh." So then he says, "So you got to pare this down." So I start paring it down. Okay, I can get rid of this project. I can get rid of that project, you know. And then we finally get to the stuff, you know, I'm like, I still don't know if I can get it down. And so finally we came to a compromise that I could have two themes in my work, right? So one was going to be like the top management and how they decided to make investments, and you know, because that came out of my dissertation. And the other was going to be the R&D and technological change. Well, on the face of it, these are not too related looking, all right? So and eventually I ended up stopping doing the managerial resources, you know, because that was how I got to that, was through my dissertation combined with Cynthia and Berger hitting me over the head with the RBD. But there weren't enough people interested. And so I kept going with the tech stuff because I had people to talk to, right? So the other thing is, it's not just you need some themes so you can build your own cumulative knowledge, but you need people to talk to, and you need a community to talk to. And the top management folks weren't really interested in internal firm resources and capabilities. And then what happened is I was able to come back around and pull these things together when I wrote the paper with Ron Adner on dynamic managerial capabilities. But that took a long time. And in the meantime, you know, people who doing the capabilities and the tech didn't know my stuff on top management and vice versa. So just as a career path, don't do that. Find a general theme, see if you can pick them. For heaven's sake, no more than two themes, all right? But one is better, you know, and you can always try and fold in your other theme, right? In some way, look for opportunities to do that if you had one, you know, something else you can't let go of. You know, so that's one piece of advice. The other is don't lose sight of the ideas. I think there's so much premium that I see in young people dealing with methods, partly because our methods have gotten more sophisticated. And I remember when I was younger, you know, trying to show my methods were like really state of the art and stuff now that looks old. You wouldn't believe it. I went and talked to econometricians to make sure, you know, this was actually okay at the time, you know. So I remember being so focused on the methods. And even now I'm still learning new methods because all this stuff is changing. And I'm not an econometrician, but I need to be at least competent, right? But that's not the be all and the end all. The methods are a route to the end. It's a means to the end. The end is greater understanding. And for that, you need ideas. For heaven's sakes, the ideas, the ideas, the ideas. What's your idea? It doesn't have to be earth shattering, but what interesting is interesting that you have to contribute. And then take the data and the methods and do the best you can with it. Don't let the search for the perfect method crowd out an interesting paper. There is no such thing as a perfect method. Period. Full stop. So that's really what I would suggest.
All right, I promised everyone that we'll open it up for questions, and we will right now. But first, I know we have a big request from the STR division for cameras to come on for just a minute or so that we can take a big screenshot and use this to remember today's conversation. Joe, should I take the screenshot? Will you?
I will. Okay, everyone, please turn on your camera, and 1, 2, 3. Perfect. Beautiful smile. Back to you, Cindy.
All right. So we have a few questions in the chat already, and I would like to start and ask Ali to ask his question. He has a question about managerial cognition for Connie. Ali, are you there? Can we call on you?
Yes. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Yeah. So thank you so much for this interesting discussion. It's really very helpful for young scholars and PhD students. I was wondering, where would you see the micro foundations movement going, especially in terms of managerial cognition? Thank you so much.
So the topic of managerial cognition sort of extends beyond the micro foundations movement. There are a range of behavioral strategy scholars interested in the cognition of individuals, and they're not necessarily interested in micro foundations per se. The sort of the Phelan and Foss version of micro foundations. I think if you think about micro foundations, it's just if you mean in terms of the role of the individual in the organization, some of that's cognition. I think that I'm not quite sure where it's going, that research on the cognition of individuals. I would say that not sure the pure micro foundation scholars are actually paying as much attention to it right now, and the work's largely conceptual because it partly gets to the difficulty of measuring cognition apart and separating it out from other factors at the individual level. That's a real challenge. Like, how do you separate cognition from human capital, for example? I guess I would look more at the behavioral strategy scholars who are looking at the cognition of individuals is what I would look at, rather than the micro foundations folks per se. They have an interest, but I think I would go to the cognition scholars. There are people like Giovanni Gavetti. He does simulations. It's largely theory, but he might give you some ideas for things you could do with it. That's where I would go.
Thank you.
Nicholas Poggioli has a couple of questions in the chat, and one in particular is about resource redeployment. Nick, I'm looking for you on the screen, but feel free to jump in. I'm sure you're gonna.
Yeah, thank you. My question is, hi Connie. My question is about resource redeployment within the field of strategy. Where do you see strategy going in response to the pandemic with the resources that we have within the field? Things like funding for tenure lines, PhD programs, new faculty recruitment. How do you think it'll change over the next 5 years or so? Thank you.
Oh, wow. I'm not sure I have a better idea than anybody else about that. I don't know. That's an honest answer. And maybe I'm not sure the pandemic per se is the issue. I think the issue is finances. And what is that going to do? And I mean, I think a particularly interesting question is, what are schools going to do with their teaching and their programs, right? You know, so we've learned a lot about how to deliver online, right? And this might affect hiring, right? What kind of people you hire. I mean, that's possibly something. I mean, I can see more direct implications for teaching and types of programs, and schools going to be exploring different ways to offer things, different types of programs. And then this might feed back to hiring. This might actually improve finances, right? So, because you can reach more people online with online or hybrid programs. So, you know, I'd love to think that strategy scholars are going to be in demand because maybe we know something about how to adapt to change, you know, and create change. But, you know, seeing how the academy works, the academy likes to keep a balance among fields, right? And, you know, keep the peace. So I'm not sure that we're going to get any special treatment, right? Even if we think we might know a little more.
Thank you.
Nikisha had a question in the chat. I'd like to bring her into the conversation if she can hear me and can unmute and ask you the question directly, Connie.
Hi, thank you. So thank you so much, Dr. Helfat, for this conversation. So I'm at Baruch College. I'm a second year PhD student. And one of the things that I latched on as you were talking is about writing about something that you find interesting and others will find interesting. And I wanted to just get your thoughts on how do you then integrate what you find interesting into the conversation that's happening in your field?
Yeah. So actually, that's a really good question because it's something that I had to deal with, right? Like, because I was interested in R&D before people were interested in R&D strategy, right? For example, right? Or I was interested in the managerial resources before, people were interested. So you just have to look for conversations, so I would look for big conversations, and say, how could my research fit into this? Right? I know what I'm interested in. I have some ideas. How can I think about these ideas in light of a big conversation that I see going on? So you have to, what helped me was to triangulate between my ideas and the conversations. And I would often maybe shift my thinking a little bit to think, how could I contribute to this conversation? I know there's a link, but how do I make it clearer? And it might actually shift the focus of my research a little bit because I wanted to contribute to a conversation. It's really lonely to work on your own. I mean, it just, and for me, I don't get any ideas if I'm just talking to myself, either on paper or in person. So I needed a conversation, and then I would go look. Where might be a route into this conversation with my ideas, right? And I would actually change my thinking a little bit about what I wanted to contribute, and it would shape my ideas a little because I wanted to contribute to a conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Tatiana had a question on sort of the integration of research and teaching. Tatiana, can I ask you to come in?
I was muted. My question is, I wonder how you integrate and how your research informs your teaching. And the reason I'm asking is that strategic management is relatively new to me. I came with master's degree in economics and PhD in political science into international business and strategic management. I got my degrees from Penn State University. And I started to teach strategic management at Haskell School of Business, and it's relatively new. So I want to, I guess, inform my teaching with research, and I wonder if there are better ways to do that.
Oh boy, I wish I had good advice for you. I didn't know much about strategy when I came into this field, right? The only thing I knew was like Michael Porter, right? So, all right, so I could teach 1 week of strategy, you know, and I knew something about transactions costs. So I started out teaching that, trying to think, what could I tell the students about something I knew, right? But then I got thrown into a big core MBA course and got told to teach Mintzberg and Waters, delivered emergent strategies. That was really, well, that was interesting. So, man, I just read like crazy, you know, to try and find out what the heck is all this stuff. And then I talked to as many colleagues as I could to get teaching ideas. But that's just sort of the basics, right? But like in terms of bringing your research in, so for me, I was able to do that either with a few sessions in the core required class or an elective. So I taught a class several years ago to the MBA students, an elective on market entry and growth. And basically that was a class on dynamic capabilities, except I didn't call it that. And, you know, and I really, you know, I wasn't straight up teaching them dynamic capabilities. I had them read half of the early T. Spisano and Schumann paper, which is fairly accessible to MBAs. But I picked a bunch of topics, you know, in terms of how do firms enter, you know, in cases, but it was motivated by my research. So it's not like a strict translation of the research, but it's motivated by it. So for the electives, I do that. And also if I had some choice in the core where I had a couple of sessions, you know, that I could add, even if I was teaching with other people, you know, then I would try and have it motivated by my research, you know. So, you know, market entry and growth, I mean, gee, that's my whole research, you know, stream, right? So that gives me, it's not just dynamic capabilities, it's resource redeployment, it's vertical integration. I mean, you name it, right? I could teach all that stuff. So I was able to think of a topic where, for a course, where I could put in a bunch of stuff I was interested in, and at least my research would inform what I taught them, even if I wasn't like taking my research and plopping it down in front of the student.
Connie, can I follow up on that? Do you ever see the classroom as a good place to sort of almost test drive some of the ideas that you would pursue in research, right? You're teaching a course on deconstructing Apple, and I'm sure that, you know, so much of what you've done in your own research applies to that, but perhaps there are many things that come to mind as you're teaching that you haven't yet researched, and then you can use that, you know, to see how it resonates with students who have themselves some work experience, to see whether it needs to be pushed forward in research.
Yeah, I haven't tried to do that. Some of my colleagues have done that and really like doing that. I think Giovanni Gavetti would be the poster child for this. He likes to take his ideas about cognition and take them to the students and see how they work. I'm more the other way around. I take my research and bring them to the students, and it's an interesting conversation, but I have not yet gotten ideas for new things to try. And maybe I'm just stubborn, but I'm pretty sure my ideas are relevant. I might not know the exact context, right? Like maybe the students can tell me other contexts where they're relevant, or some contexts I hadn't thought about where they're actually not relevant, right? So it's like the boundary conditions for my ideas. That's what I get from the students. And that is actually helpful. That is actually helpful.
Heather, you'd like to ask Connie about SMJ, getting more involved with SMJ or other journals, top journals.
Yeah, sure. So first, thanks, Connie, for your comments on contributing to a body of research. I think this has been really interesting. I'm trying to also ask a more practical question, because I know there's junior scholars and PhD students who are listening here. And so I'm just wondering, from all your years at SMJ, if you have any advice for junior colleagues who want to get more involved at SMJ, and also just from the reviews that you've seen, if you have any specific advice as junior scholars are, you know, writing these, just how to do them in a way that's helpful to AEs, helpful to editors. Just more reflections on that, if you are willing.
Oh yeah, of course. So, and we have several editors here of SMJ, including Heather's here. I think Min Wan's here. Probably some others I'm missing. So you can ask them too, Jiao, obviously. So, you know, it's not just SMJ. All right. I mean, there are a lot of journals in our field, right? And there are a lot of really good journals in our field. So the question is how to get more involved. Well, you can volunteer your services, but I mean, you know, if you sort of emails that come over the transom are less helpful than, you know, if you know someone who knows someone who's an editor at a journal, that helps to volunteer your services. And the really critical thing is if you get asked to do a review, do it. All right. That's how you get on editorial boards. You get on editorial boards by doing good reviews, right? And even that's how you get asked to do more than one review, right? And so it really comes to the question of what's a good review, really, you know, and that's what you asked me about. So what's a good review? So I remember, so I will tell you something that all editors know, all seasoned editors know, that the more junior the colleague, the harsher the review. This is like a truth. All right. So, and I remember writing these obnoxious reviews when I was younger. Maybe obnoxious is the wrong word, but picky, you know, this is all bad. It needs to be done better, you know, and okay. So this is all well and good, but you want to look and see like, what's the core of what the author's trying to do? And try and say something positive to begin with, right? You know, and then try and give some constructive advice. And if you think there are things that are just simply, you know, not acceptable, then you can say so. But the tone really matters of the review. Instead of this is all trash, right? Say, look, I think this is a fundamental problem. Here's why. You know, a very factual, matter of fact, but clear statement. And being clear that you think it's a fundamental problem, right? And also calibrate. What are the fundamental problems and what are the potentially fixable? And then sometimes you might actually get a paper you think is fixable. So, you know, that would be the tone of the review, even if you think there are problems. And the other thing I would really urge you to do is please do not put your opinion about the paper in the review. Right? You do not want to tie the editor's hands. There is always an opportunity to write a note to the editor about what you think, right? And you can always put your recommendation for reject or accept or revision. There's always a box for that, right? That does not need to go in the review. Really, the review is not the place to give your overall opinion on the paper. The review is for your feedback. So.
Switching to sort of this big discussion between phenomenon-driven and theory-driven, Thomas has a question on that specific topic.
Hi, thank everyone. Thank you, Connie, for being here. My question is really simple. So what is your advice in terms of pursuing phenomenon-driven versus theory-driven research, especially if you're interested in contexts that are interesting outside the US? So social entrepreneurship or any type of state-owned enterprises, something that's more interesting, maybe in Europe, Asia, or Latin America?
Yeah, let me answer that without reference to where something is interesting. I do think there are themes that get more uptake in different parts of the world, but I think all these questions are relevant to strategy, regardless of where there's more uptake. So I think, so this notion of asking research questions is something that I think our field hasn't come to terms with yet. In other fields, it's really like that's how they do research. If you go to economics, they're not posing hypotheses in most papers. They're asking a well-informed question. And part of the reason for this is the theory, say in economics, is much more narrow, right? So it's really clear what the research question is, right? Because there's this very narrow, the fairly well understood, set of literature. And so then you don't need to pose a hypothesis. It's really obvious what you should be doing. You don't even need to write out a question. So, so then we come to strategy and how do you do this, right? How do you do research that might investigate a phenomenon or pose a question? So that the simple version of this is, well, if you have a setting where there's not clear theory, right? That's the most obvious way to say, well, I'm going to pose some well-informed questions. I mean, they can't just, I'm not a big fan of what I call brute empiricism, where you just take a data set and march, apply a bunch of analyses and say, look what I found. I'm like, well, why should I care? Right? Tell me up front, what's some of the theory we already know? What kind of phenomenon, what kind of research findings empirically have there been? Right? So you at least motivate the question. But I think the easy thing is where there's not clear theory, right? Or not clear enough theory, right? Where you don't want to feel like you're pulling a rabbit out of a hat and saying, aha, I have a theory and I have a context, and I'm gonna put them together, So, that's the most obvious route into this kind of research. I actually, I go out on a limb and say, I personally would like to see more question-based research, even when there is some theory, right? Instead of like being forced to gin up a hypothesis, right? But I'm probably in the minority of the field. So I would say for question-based research, if you want to get your paper published, the easiest route in is to use it when there's a new phenomenon, or when there's a phenomenon, it doesn't be new, that hasn't been as investigated in different settings, right? Different countries, different time periods, where it's not clear how the theory, you don't have a clear prediction. So, and then you have to really justify it up front in the paper. You actually have to tackle that head on. Here's why we're using this approach. So that people don't say, where's the theory? Because that is the knee-jerk reaction, unfortunately. And some journals, there are some journals, if you take that approach, where you can't send your paper because they require theory, testing theory. Some journals even require new theory, which I'm really not a fan of. But some journals just simply require that you test theory. And so but SMJ doesn't require that. Org Science doesn't require that. Category Management Discoveries obviously does not require that. So there are really good journals where you can send question and phenomenon-based research.
MK, feel free to jump in with your question.
Hi, this is MK Chin at Indiana University. Hi, Connie, good to see you.
Hey.
Thanks for sharing your insights. This has been great discussion. I have some questions about your thought on dynamic managerial capability research. Well, I'm just curious of your thought on the potential of some future research on dynamic managerial capabilities. Do you see more challenges or the room for making more contributions, or because my understanding of this stream of research is mainly based on conceptual papers, and I think it's more because of difficulties in collecting data about capturing, measuring, seizing, and reconfiguration and sensing those stages. So I'm just curious about your general thought on the potential of this stream of research. Do you think we know enough about this? If the field has already established good framework here, or do you feel like there is more steps to be done or room to be filled? Yeah, so that would be my question.
So I would agree with your assessment that most, maybe not all, but most of the research is conceptual and theoretical. In part, maybe, I don't know how much of the reason is because it is difficult to measure these capabilities. It's probably a contributing factor, right? I also think that people who are really steeped in dynamic capabilities tend to be more conceptually oriented, and so it's sort of a chicken and egg problem. I do think also a lot of people who are interested in dynamic capabilities tend to be qualitative researchers, conceptual and qualitative research. So I actually think there is an opportunity, more opportunity to use qualitative empirical research to try and unpack some of these concepts and what's driving them. I have not nailed the how to measure quantitatively problem. I had a paper with Philip Meyer Doyle and Sun-Kee Lee where we tried to get at this, and we couldn't tease it out much. So it got taken out of the paper, and it's now in the discussion and conclusion. Well, in future work, maybe we could think about this, you know? So I don't know what the solution is. I'm counting on you guys, anyone who's interested, to come up with some clever research design. You know, I hate to say this, but you know, things like exogenous shocks, where you might actually be able to tease out what it would do to my managerial capabilities, and then use that as sort of a proxy for way of getting at the extent to which these managerial capabilities are having an effect, rather than trying to tease out, well, this is sensing, this is seizing, this is reconfiguring. I think that's a very difficult task empirically, because they all go together. And, you know, sensing and, you know, it's a big cycle with tons of feedback loops. So I actually not sure that's as helpful. And even if you go the route that I like, which is, you know, human capital, social capital, cognition, those also are linked, right? And a little hard to unpack. Although I think unpacking the social capital from the others is easier. But again, I would look for things where you can, or even comparing settings where one is going to likely to push the capability, impact of capabilities in a different direction than the other. That's where I might go, rather than trying to dig into the details, which were really hard to unpack empirically.
Thank you.
Natalia, and then Asim.
Thanks so much. And Connie, it's great to see you. And I didn't recognize you because your hair has gotten so long. So I'm like, who is that graduate student? As we're all dreaming of our next haircut. My question is, how much need do you see for an intellectual history of the field as something we teach our PhD students in the spirit of this cumulative knowledge? Yeah. And this is inspired and taught by Tatiana's question, where, you know, in the classroom, I tell my MBA students that, you know, what they think of as private equity and new and shiny was leveraged buyouts in the 80s.
Yes.
And I use words like cash cow in my class. And I don't know that there is a space in which we do that with doctoral students.
Yeah. So that's, I think it's a great idea to have something like that. I think that, you know, when the field was early, it was well understood, right? And it was a smaller field too. But, you know, I don't know how much in the strategy courses that are taught, the base ones in PhD programs, some of the early history gets taught of some of these ideas, right? The BCG matrix, for example, right? And like what's a star, right? For example, it's a cash cow, and some of these were quite managerial frameworks, but they are the basis for the field. So there's that history, right, of just the progression of ideas. And I think, there's always a tendency in any academic field to concentrate on what's like new and shiny, forget about some of the history. And some of us have always bemoaned this a little. So the other part of it is the history of the field in terms of its intellectual heritage, right? And I think that's really important because strategy is an interdisciplinary field. It's incredibly difficult to keep a field interdisciplinary and not pull off to the disciplines, right? And without something to hold it together, we will end up being a field of bad economics, bad sociology, and bad psychology. And then we will have no reason to exist. All right, I'm going to put that really bluntly. And I'm always worried about it because I think there's value in having an interdisciplinary field. That's why I left economics. Economics doesn't look at stuff the way we do in strategy, and they don't learn things, and they don't know how firms operate, pure and simple, and it's not clear to me they ever will. They will pick off some things, same with sociology. So there's contributions from those fields, and it's worth reading some of the literature. But so maybe some of the heritage of the history of the field and what makes it unique is really, we need some way to pass that on. And also, I got converted. I was a willing convert from economics, but I got converted. I was basically told you have to be in the field of strategy. You can't be an economist and read all this stuff and figure out how to talk to this audience. And I think that's really critical, particularly as some schools are bringing more people in from these fields. Those fields have gotten what I would call more disciplinary than they used to be. So, and so we have a bigger challenge. So maybe having some history of not just the ideas, but also the evolution of the field and what makes it a field. It strikes me as important.
Wasim.
Thanks, Cynthia. Connie, always a pleasure. I guess not to take away from your empirical work, but I mean, as someone who's written some of, I think, the most exciting seminal theory pieces in the last 20 years in our field, and I mean, I would put them in the chat, but it would basically blow up the chat, so I'm not going to do that. So I'm just curious on your take on sort of the differences between writing, pure theory papers versus empirical papers. What are the pros and cons of doing that? What are the challenges of doing that? Just kind of, how do you think about sort of theory papers as just theory papers as opposed to, empirical pieces?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for those very kind words. So I think what we're talking about here is conceptual theory papers, right? I mean, I've used a little math in my papers. If I could have one paper where the reviewers and editor made me take the math out because they said, look, the idea is intuitive. We don't need the audit trail. I kept the graphs in. I just insisted I needed something. But the real issue is how to write these conceptual papers. It's one thing to write a math paper. Those ideas tend to be fairly narrow. There you need, it needs to be interesting and clear and, contribute something. But the conceptual papers, boy, those are hard to write. They're hard to write because A, there's lots of things you can't nail down, right? And B, it's really hard to communicate some of these ideas in words. This is like, so that other people understand what's in your head. It's incredibly difficult. So our first piece of advice is keep it as simple as possible, right? Something complicated, there's going to be too many feedback loops, too many loose ends, so try and nail it down to the core idea. Writing a conceptual paper is, with so many things going on, is really difficult. And a simpler idea is, all else equal, will have more impact, right? Because people can remember it. Why do people remember sensing, seizing, and reconfiguring? Because it's simple, right? And it resonates, right? So I think that's a really key thing. The other thing is get feedback, from people, what is not clear, and take the review process as a positive. The reviewers are telling you what doesn't make sense, right? You may think it makes perfect sense, but they don't. There's probably some truth to that, right? So I think there's a simple, clear, and then try and answer as many questions as you think people are going to have. Like when people give you feedback on the paper and they have all these questions, go, okay, I have to figure out a way to deal with these questions in the paper, right? They're hard. It's really hard to write. It's really hard to write. And I think feedback is really critical.
Connie, Tim has a question. Just as he's taking a sip of his coffee, I'm going to call on him to ask his question about corporate purpose.
Yeah, this is a little bit off the track, but given your figurehead role in the field, this topic of corporate purpose and what should our objective function be is coming to the fore, even more than a decade ago. It has implications for our empiricism what should our dependent variable be, for example? So I'm just curious about your thoughts on this. Is this a worthwhile pursuit for the division? Who do you look to as leading seminal thinkers on the topic? Those sorts of things.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been thinking about this lately, about corporate purpose, because, it's all tied up with the, it's got two parts to it. One, it's got the sort of social purpose part, right? And two, it's got the motivating the organization part, like having people care. And so I think it's been coming up on our research agenda, and I think it's partly been coming up because of the real world, right? More and more people care more. And if you think about the history of corporate purpose, we could go back to the 1800s and the early 1900s. What the heck corporate purpose was there? And, bloodying the union workers, or people who are trying to unionize. It's not like our wonderful corporations were all full of corporate purpose. All right. So, maybe we need a little historical reboot here. Right. So then you go, okay, well, what was the heyday of corporate purpose in some sense? In the US, I think it was after World War II. Right. This was until, the 60s or 70s, right? This was a period of huge economic growth, right? And where the corporations, they built, they had company towns from before. Some of those were quite exploitative, like the mills, we have in New England. But, like General Motors, building up Minneapolis, for example, right? Because your goals are aligned with the community, and you had the slack, right? You weren't under this tight profit constraint, right? So it's kind of win-win. Your shareholders did well because there's growth. You can help the community, which gives you educated workers and a pool, and, and it all works well when everything's growing, right? So now we have a situation where the world's more competitive. There's a lot more tensions economically. We're not in a high growth era in the US, right? And this issue of where the core, and some people attribute the lack of corporate purpose to the rise of the financial, community. I don't know what the cause is, but I think it's coming back up on the agenda. And I actually think companies are having to think more about this as a result. It's sort of gone, it went by the wayside. And when I think about corporate purpose, I'd like to see much more thought about, well, what do we mean by that specifically? And what are the benefits and costs of this, right? And there's no free lunch. I'm enough of an economist to know this, okay? So that's what I'd like to know. I'd like to go beyond exhortations of, oh, we need corporate purpose and feel good, and notions that this is win-win or not win-win. We have people on both sides of the aisle shouting at each other. Could we actually think about what this is, what it means, and then think about, and then look at what are firms doing, right? Always go to what are firms doing, right? So I do think it's an important agenda. I have been thinking a lot more about it. I'm not sure if I'll do research on it, but it is actually something I think is not receiving as much sort of what I call sustained, deep academic attention.
Thank you.
Connie, one last question from Dennis, and then I want to give you the heads up that we have a lightning round of a few questions very quickly towards the end, and we'll end on that. So Dennis.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly.
Okay, sorry, I don't know why my cam isn't working today, but I'll make it very quick. I'm working on a paper on board governance and agency theory. Connie, my question to you is, I would like to know your take on the application of dynamic capability on boards, because we are dealing with resource base and the theory, and yeah, how do you look at that with board?
Well, I mean, a few people have thought about, I don't know how many papers are published about the dynamic capabilities of board members. and managerial resources of board members. So I think, that would be the way I would think about it, but that just comes out of my interest in research. There are some papers suggesting we need to think, I don't know, I saw something recently, I don't remember where, that, you can't monitor as an agent without having capability, right? I mean, you give me some information as a monitor, but I don't have the capacity to figure out what that means and provide advice. It's not much good. So I would actually look at the interaction of the capabilities and the monitoring.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Connie, are you ready? These are, Samina deserves all the credit and all the blame for putting wonderful Meet the Scholars participants through a lightning round of questions, but here we go. What is your favorite place you've ever visited or traveled to?
Oh, geez. Paris.
Paris. When you're not reading strategy scholarship, do you read fiction or nonfiction?
Probably nonfiction.
Nonfiction. What superpower would you rather have? Invisibility, flight, or reading minds?
Oh, reading minds, even though it'd be really scary.
Reviewers' minds, first and foremost. If you could have dinner and conversation with one deceased past person from the historical past, who would that person be?
No, Abraham Lincoln.
And what do you do to relax, unwind, or recharge?
I go jogging every day.
Those are all the questions. I have one more, actually, if you don't mind me spending the last 2 minutes on this. How does somebody from California become sort of a true believer? Well, what do you call people from New Hampshire?
New Hampshire, right? I don't know. Taciturn New Englanders. What do you call people from New Hampshire? How do you do that?
How do you do that?
Oh, it's
What
a
does it
train.
take?
Yeah, but it was not the first time I've lived in the cold, right? So I went from California to Yale, right? And I remember one day, I got a warm coat and all that, but I remember one day it had warmed up to, I don't know what, it was maybe 40 degrees. And there's a little green outside of the SOM building there. And it was a pretty new building. It was really pretty. And the grass was no longer snow covered. I couldn't figure out why no one was out there. Everyone's inside in the cafeteria. I thought this was the strangest thing. So I sat down my coat and I sat on the grass for a while and I read and it was great. It was warm. And somebody told me later that my friends had seen me out there and thought, what the heck is Connie doing out there? And then someone said, oh yeah, that's California, Connie. You don't realize you don't sit out on the grass when it's 40 degrees. So I've adapted over time, but just adapt. It's a slow process. I like snow. I ski. You got to get out. You got to hike in the snow. You got snowshoes. It's just a little long up here. That's my only complaint. It's a month too long. Winter.
Connie, we're incredibly grateful for your time and of course for all your insights and for sharing your history with us. We look forward to seeing you in person, hopefully before long. And thank you everyone for joining us today. See you next time.
Thank you guys for having me. It was really a pleasure. It's wonderful to see so many people I know, people I don't know, and thanks for hosting me. It was really fun.
Thank you, Connie. Bye, everyone.
Okay, take care, everybody.